Welcome to the Find Your Feminine Fire podcast. I'm your host, renowned sex and relationship coach Amanda Testa. And if you are looking to reclaim your sexual desire, take sex from a to-do to something you look forward to, and enjoy deeply connected relationships without adding more to your already full plate, then you are in the right place. Listen in to discover how to fan the flames of your feminine fire, fall in love with your sensual self again, and experience intimacy like never before, all in a way that feels really good to your system. Make yourself comfortable and enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome. I know many of you listeners out there are curious to explore the cutting-edge therapies to really enhance well-being, and you are in the right place. Today, we are going to be diving deep into the realm of psychedelic-assisted therapy with Rais. She is the CEO and co-founder of Enthea. Sherry has been at the forefront of blending purpose with professionalism, guiding entities from startups to global organizations like the United Nations and World Bank in achieving their mission. Today, you're going to discover why her work is so pivotal in the current wellness revolution and how Enthea is making psychedelic therapy accessible to more. With Sherry's rich background in public policy, in-depth research in psychedelics, and her dedication to reducing human suffering, you're going to gain some very valuable insights today into the future of mental health care. So welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. As those of you who are listening know, we are just kind of relaunching the podcast. And this is very exciting to have all these wonderful guests really at the forefront of groundbreaking work to improve well-being and bringing healthcare to more. So welcome, Sherry. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for the really kind introduction.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is very groundbreaking nowadays. The medical field is becoming bringing this medicine more mainstream, which obviously the indigenous cultures have been using these types of medicines for years and years and really first and foremost honoring those traditions. But I'd love to just hear a little bit more from you on your journey of what kind of led you into this field.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I, as you mentioned, worked for a long time consulting to the UN and the World Bank. And in that work, which is, I think, still very much on the same theme of what I'm doing now, aligned with my purpose and trying to reduce human suffering. But in that work, I was focused on poverty reduction. And so I spent 10 years on the front lines in various countries, working with presidents and prime ministers and heads of state on poverty reduction programs in fairly resource-constrained environments, many parts of Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and South America, and some of the world's poorest countries. And I saw firsthand the effects of intergenerational trauma and poverty and conflict, war on community. My job was to find ways to reduce poverty, but it's not like that exists in a silo or in a bubble. In order to do that, you need to address it sort of holistically and kind of look at everything. And so we implemented many initiatives with that goal to reduce poverty. And over the years, I would go back to places and do impact reports or impact assessments to measure outcomes. And forgive me if this is a longer answer than you expected. I'd go back to do these impact reports and we would see that, okay, some of the initiatives we've implemented work, maybe roughly half of the people we worked with would come out of poverty in 2 years, which is great and a tremendous achievement. But what about the other half? What about that other 50% was the question on my mind? Because from the outside, it looked like we were addressing the issue quite holistically, and yet you'd have half the population not coming out of poverty. And to me, the answer was very clear that we were not looking at mental health. And the data also showed that roughly half of the people were also suffering from severe mental health conditions. And so to me, this wasn't a coincidence.
Yeah.
So I began to look for ways to address this issue of mental health, and saw that unfortunately, most of the ways that we're addressing mental health aren't really working. That's not to say that nothing works, but that it's really not working well. At best, what we're doing with the medications that people are on is masking symptoms. There's some studies that say that antidepressants only work very well for 15% of people that take them. And they come with a lot of side effects. And we can talk more about how this affects women as well, because there's a lot of data on that too. But people are often taking medications for years, if not decades, and playing with dosages. And at the end of the day, not feeling cured. There I was looking for solutions and kind of surprised by this data that didn't inspire a lot of hope. And then I stumbled upon all this data on psychedelic therapy. And in a nutshell, because I'm sure we'll get into it, the data on psychedelic therapy shows that from 1 to 6 sessions with psychedelic therapy in clinical trials, 60 to 85% of people are walking away at 1 year follow-up, like really cured, meaning they're doing a short amount of sessions, like few, they're doing it in a short period of time. There are limited side effects. It's not something you have to take every day or keep doing for the rest of your life. And 1 year later, people will no longer show signs of depression or PTSD or anxiety. And these are people who had struggled with it for decades. So I saw this data and I was like, wow, this is probably too good to be true. And one thing led to another. The more I went into this rabbit hole of the potential of psychedelics, the more I felt I wanted to help people get access to it. It was probably premature at the time. This was like 6.5 years ago for the organizations I was working with then, consulting to the UN and the World Bank, to be introducing or trying to implement psychedelic therapy initiatives, given that they weren't even legal. They're not legal in most of the world. And we don't have a lot of use cases of, their effects. I mean, we do have great data, but 6.5 years ago, trying to pitch this to the UN would have probably been hard. And so I ultimately decided to leave a profession that brought me a lot of meaning and purpose and joy, and take a risk and see, can I take what I had built in 10 years of sort of implementing very difficult programs in resource constrained environments, can I take those skills and apply them to the psychedelic therapy space? And that's how I started my current company, Enthea.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing what led you to this. And also just really what I hear in your words is just like the possibility, the hope that is the potential with the psychedelic assisted therapy, and really helping make a dent in dental health, and like really making it, healing people, curing people, where to the point where they don't have to continue to be on medication. And again, for everyone out there, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't just to say that if things are working, great. But also there's so many great things coming up now that are really exciting. So I would love if you would maybe share a little bit about some of the direct benefits of psychedelic therapy, and maybe then kind of pinpoint in a little more to what some of the current things around women's health and how that's affected too, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So if it's okay, I'll go in the reverse order start with the women's health context to lay the foundation, although I'm sure your listeners are already aware of these issues. But in general, women are diagnosed with depression at least twice the rate of men. They are also more likely to experience anxiety disorders. It's, I think, 60% of anxiety disorders are women and 40% are men. 1 in 8 women experience postpartum depression, which we don't talk about nearly enough. That's more than 10%. Think of all of these women that are honestly usually suffering in silence because there's so much shame around postpartum depression. There's also premenstrual dysphoric, I'm really bad at pronouncing things, disorder, PMDD, which is like a severe form of PMS that really affects our mood as well. So it's not just the physical symptoms that affects, I think, 5% of women. And then I'm going to stop spewing out all this data, but I think, again, important for context, women have higher rates of eating disorders. With sexual assault, 1 in 3 women in the US will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. Men experience sexual violence too, for any of the male listeners, but just not as often. And that sexual assault and sexual violence often leads to depression, anxiety, and PTSD and substance use disorders. So with that as context, women just have so much to deal with. And this is not to say that men don't, but they have different predispositions. And enter psychedelic assisted therapy, where there's this potential and this hope that you can take a psychedelic substance. And by the way, when I say psychedelic assisted therapy, I'm not talking about taking psychedelics and like going and having a trip in the forest on your own. That's something some people do, but not what I'm referring to when I'm talking about psychedelic assisted therapy. But in a clinical and supervised setting, you're taking this substance and combining it with therapy, which the research shows if you don't do the therapy, it's not as effective, not even close to as effective. Combining with therapy to get to the root cause of your trauma, your depression, your anxiety. And the way this is possible, if I may go a little bit into the science, is that traditional psychedelics work on the 5-HT2A receptors in the brain. Ketamine works on the NMDA receptor in the brain. But what this means is that rather than just increasing serotonin, like a lot of the antidepressant medications that we take do, SSRIs, these work on serotonin receptors in the brain and different receptors in the brain to teach your brain how to produce things like serotonin naturally. And I think more importantly, psychedelics are unique in that they're one of the few substances we can take to increase neuroplasticity in the brain. And so by increasing neuroplasticity, your brain is allowed to form new connections, new synapses, and actually override some of the negative thinking and negative thought patterns in our brain with positive ones. And that's why having a therapist there is really important, and doing integration is really important as well. And also in this altered state, when you have this increased neuroplasticity and you have a therapist that you're talking to, you're able to revisit some of the memories that perhaps caused a lot of trauma, but revisit them in a way that doesn't bring on all of that anxiety and depression. So you can revisit them and make peace with them, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell why I'm so excited about this treatment and why it's specifically, I think, relevant to women. We didn't even talk about couples therapy. That's a whole other area too. And the data is extremely compelling. I mentioned at a high level what we've seen in clinical trials, but with Enthea and the data with like Enthea is seen with patients from ketamine assisted therapy, we've seen at 1 year follow-up an 86% reduction in PTSD, a 67% reduction in depression, a 65% reduction in anxiety, and at 1 year follow-up, 82% of patients that did ketamine therapy like via Enthea were no longer on antidepressants. I wish I had that data broken down by women and men, but I unfortunately don't. But I should. But the fact that 82% were no longer on antidepressants is just telling enough of how transformative these medicines are.
I think that's huge. And just for those who are curious, maybe just give a quick overview of what your company does and how it supports companies to use your services to support their employees and whatnot. Just a quick overview, just because I think it's so fascinating. And I think too, as a consumer, we can find individual support, but also maybe you're working for a big company and you want to encourage them to look at these options.
Yeah. So when I got into this field, quickly realized there are two areas where the industry probably needs support. One is we don't have enough trained therapists, trained psychedelic therapists. And as these medicines become approved, and I'll talk about approval in a second, some estimates say we might need 100,000 or more trained therapists, and we are way below that number. So I, on the one side, I got trained at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I did a certificate in psychedelic therapy and research. And I have been consulting and advising that university ever since to help them expand their training initiatives. But the other side of the equation of where the industry and ecosystem needs support is there aren't good mechanisms for reimbursement. And so right now, ketamine assisted therapy is legal and available nationwide and very beneficial for all of the conditions we talked about, as well as alcohol and substance abuse. But it's not covered by major insurance carriers. So people have to pay out of pocket. Also, other psychedelics, which will hopefully soon be approved, and I can talk about what those other ones are, will also likely not be covered by insurance as soon as they're approved. It'll take some time if they ever get approved. Hopefully they will. But I was looking at this and I was like, This is outrageous to me that people have been suffering for years, if not decades. For some reason, their insurance covers all of these medications for years, if not decades, which is thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And those medications are not necessarily helping them. So I helped create this company called Enthea. And what we do is we create benefit plans that employers can easily adopt as an additional benefit, very similar to like dental or vision, or how they adopt sort of like mental health carve outs or mental health add ons for their employees. And so this is an additional benefit they can adopt so they can offer these innovative treatments like ketamine assisted therapy to their employees. So the employees either don't have to pay out of pocket at all or can pay a reduced rate, like with a copay or co-insurance. So sort of eliminating that cost burden to get people access. And then another thing that Enthea does is we are building a network of vetted, credentialed therapists. Because another problem is because this industry is so new, there aren't really third-party mechanisms for knowing, like with other professions, with doctors and lawyers and plastic surgeons and psychiatrists, there's boards and certificates that you have to do and keep up with to keep your license. But that doesn't exist yet in the psychedelic field. And so the other service we offer is we've spent years actually before going to market building a credentialing process and standards of care and medical policies, and then building a network of what we believe are the best of the best providers, so people know that they're not just accessing care that's affordable, but they're also accessing care that's safe and not just going to some random clinic.
Hey, it's Amanda. If you are enjoying the show and felt a connection to what we've discussed, and you're ready to take the next step in reigniting your passion and enhancing your relationships, I have something special for you. Visit www.amandatesta.com/thegoods, where you can subscribe to my email. And if you want, you can sign up for a free personalized sensuality discovery session with me. In this one-on-one heart-to-heart session, we'll explore your unique desires, uncover any challenges, and set a path for you to experience the vibrant, fulfilling love life you deserve. Don't let another day pass feeling unfulfilled or disconnection. Take action now, and let's start this beautiful journey together to fire up your feminine fire. Join me at amandatesta.com/thegoods. I'm excited to stay connected. Now back to the show. I would like to speak to that because I think that's when people are really excited and they just want to like go find a solution. And so maybe they just Google like ketamine assisted therapy in their neighborhood or whatever. So how can you ensure that you are finding someone who's reputable? Because I know I have people I know that have gone to someone who just is using their license, but they don't even have any interaction with the patient at all. It's like a nurse or someone else administering the ketamine. And there's a lot of those types of clinics too. So I'm curious, how can people be savvy consumers?
Well, my obvious answer is work with Enthea and we have a network, but no, but that's not possible for everyone, and not all employers are in a position to adopt this. And there's individuals out there that just want to know how to get help. I get it. So here are some tips. One, you pointed out there's a lot of places that just have a nurse or someone administering ketamine and no therapy. Those are ketamine infusion clinics. And unfortunately, the branding is a little bit confusing because you can Google ketamine therapy and you can then find a ketamine infusion clinic that only gives you the ketamine and doesn't do the therapy. But they call it ketamine therapy because the fact that they are administering something, it's a therapy in a way. So it's very confusing language for someone who's not in the know. And some advice would be to Google ketamine assisted therapy or ketamine assisted psychotherapy, one of those two options. And then the city name, if you're looking for a city. Usually when you do that, Psychology Today, I think, will come up with like a good list to start off with. They still won't all be what you're looking for. The next thing you want to look for when you're on the website, let's say you find a place from Google and then you go on the website first, you look at the team and make sure that the team consists of a licensed social worker or a psychologist or counselor, someone with this kind of licensing, and not just nurses and psychiatrists and doctors. So that's like an important to look for the credentials of the people on the website. And also almost always, if the company offers ketamine assisted therapy, their website will say services or treatments with a drop down. And it'll not just say ketamine therapy or ketamine treatments or ketamine infusion. It will say ketamine assisted therapy. And so my big recommendation is to only go to ones that say that. And if you're unsure, then before booking an appointment or going in for a treatment, call the clinic up and say, I'm looking for ketamine assisted therapy, and not just ketamine treatments and not just ketamine infusion, but actual psychotherapy with the ketamine. So that's my advice there.
I'm curious too, just this is kind of a random question, but it came to mind because I'm curious your thoughts on the pros and cons of big pharma getting involved in psychedelic space.
Well, this might get me in trouble, but that's okay. We'll go there.
Well, you can just speak to what you want to, and don't feel like you have to answer any question you don't want to answer. That's totally fine too.
No, it's okay. So let's take a really good example, which is the example of ketamine. Ketamine is a generic drug that has been used actually for 60 years, I think, as an anesthetic in higher doses. We have at least 50, if not 60 years of safety and efficacy data. We use it in children as an anesthetic, again, in higher doses than we would as a mental health treatment. It's in every hospital and ER and almost every ambulance. So it's quite common. I don't know if I mentioned it's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. I may have said that already. And a dose of generic ketamine for these behavioral health treatments we're talking about would be $5, roughly $5 to $7, let's say. Big Pharma made a branded version of ketamine called Spravato, and Spravato costs $500 to $1,000 for one dose. And also, the idea of ketamine assisted therapy, like we said, is to get you off of your antidepressants, to get you to a place where you feel cured and healed and get to the root cause of your underlying condition. The treatment protocol for Spravato, done by Big Pharma, is actually, it's a nasal spray. So that's the mode of administration. And the protocol is that you do this spray every week in conjunction with your existing medications. So the idea is not to take you off of your medications, it's to add on another medication on top of your existing medications, and to just add something on weekly, with no end in sight. And so you're looking at, given the cost, like $45,000 a year to do this branded version of ketamine, Spravato, versus if you were to do ketamine assisted therapy and complete a full quality treatment, meaning you're doing preparation with a therapist, you're then doing 4 to 6 medicine sessions, and then you're doing integration with the therapist after. And then the idea is you no longer need to be on antidepressants. That on average, it's a wide range depending on city and stuff, but on average would be $6,000. And that's a once off. And so that example probably tells you a lot about my thoughts on Big Pharma. We need Big Pharma in some ways, just to be clear, to produce some drugs, and drugs we need in high quantities. We need them, and to make them accessible in different parts of the world. We wouldn't be able to treat illnesses without some of these large companies. But sometimes we don't need that, and profit seeking gets in the way of healing. And so, yeah.
I think you're right. And there's so many nuances there. I was just curious. I am doing a psychedelic assisted integration therapy or facilitator through kind of embodying a lot of the somatic experiencing work I do, weaving in psychedelics for healing with regards to the work that I do around sex and relationships specifically. But I met someone who was in my group who actually works for Big Pharma, and I appreciated that they were there in this training because it's a very thorough kind of going through all the nooks and crannies, that trying to make sure that perspective gets brought to the corporate side, which I think is important, because I do feel like it's such healing work, and it would be amazing if it could be more accessible. And so I'm curious too, just in general, there's a lack of funding for women's gender specific studies around women's health and specifically around how psychedelics can help. And I would love if you would share a little bit more about like the relational, like couples, how they're using it in couples therapy. I know there's been a lot of great research around MDMA in therapy. In my personal experience and working with clients with psilocybin, I've seen amazing results with connectivity and just I feel like in some ways there is that neuroplasticity, but also just in general, kind of opening the door a little bit and a door that may not be opened otherwise, right? There's a lot of tools that people can use to access these different states of their brain, but I feel like sometimes it can be an easier way to create access. I'm curious your thoughts on that. That's kind of a two-part question.
I like where your question is going. So if you've spoken to some people who have worked with these medicines, I think while there are very clear clinical indications for why you would do psychedelic assisted therapy, and there are so specific diagnoses that fall under the categories of why you would do ketamine therapy. It's so interesting that when you get to the root cause of trauma and when you actually feel healed, there are so many other spillover effects, let's say, where you'll speak to people who have done psychedelic assisted therapy and they'll say, this wasn't their intention, but they'll say, I haven't drank alcohol since. And that was, they weren't going in for alcohol use, they were going in for something else, right? But I haven't drank alcohol since, or ever since then, I'm intermittent fasting, or ever since then, I'm eating clean, or ever since then, I'm spending more time in nature. There's actual studies that show how psychedelic therapy makes us feel more connected to nature and to each other and have more empathy. Actually, I forget the statistic. I always forget this one. There's so many good stats in my head, but that it's definitely a majority of people who completed psychedelic therapy in early trials, definitely over 50%, but I don't know if it's 60 or 70%, rated as one of their top 3 life experiences. That is extremely powerful. They're rating it up there with like getting married and having a kid. So that also says a lot, but you often hear, and there's tons of communities online, meetups online of people talking about their psychedelic experiences. And I mean, you don't really have a lot of meetups to be like, hey, like, let's talk about what it's like being on Xanax. Like, let's talk about what it's like being on Zoloft, right? Like, you don't have a lot of meetups. So if you go on meetup.com right now and type psychedelics, like in almost every major city, there's some sort of community forming with people talking about their experiences, because it's also been like a catalyst or ignited a change in them where they want to live more purposeful, meaningful lives, where they want to find more meaning in their work, where they're feeling more creative, where they've repaired relationships with loved ones where there were issues. One of the things I think is interesting that some of our modern day inventions were actually invented during a psychedelic trip, not necessarily during psychedelic assisted therapy, but during a psychedelic trip. So being in that state, like the structure of DNA was invented, I think, on an acid trip. The PCR test that we use for COVID, not the specific one for COVID, but that technology of PCR was invented during a psychedelic trip. I think I've also heard like the mouse, which now I no longer use a mouse with my computer, but with the mouse. But so that's just to speak to like the creativity boost. But going back to like your point of this often is a catalyst of change, and then people want to live more whole, purposeful, healing filled lives. Changes in diet is often an after effect. So yeah.
Yeah. Beyond the current state of psychedelic research and therapy, I'm curious, what is your ultimate vision for how these treatments can revolutionize women's health and societal well-being in general in the long term?
Okay. That's a great question. One, I think it can revolutionize women's health and people's health in general. So I have this vision. It's an optimistic vision, but talking like in the future, right? These medicines become approved, they become accessible, they are covered. We use them safely with the right set and setting, but they become very accessible. So it wouldn't be weird to tell someone like, hey, I'm going to do some psilocybin assisted therapy next week, or I'm going to do some LSD assisted therapy. Like these will be normal things to say and accessible for all, such that we really get to a point where, not that we have Rick Doblin from MAPS, who if that name is new to you, like just Google who that is and watch all of the videos you can find on him speaking, because he's amazing and the whole field owes so much to him. But he often speaks of like net zero trauma, like getting to a place where we have net zero trauma. So we're not creating more trauma. And like, if you think about it, if we start that process now, then we will create kids who have this loving, whole, happy lives. And when they have kids, it might be too late for our generation as we're raising kids. They might have some trauma already, but because we're human. But maybe our kids' generation, when they raise kids, there'll be less trauma. I don't know about zero trauma because the world is the world, but I think we can significantly reduce the amount of trauma and suffering in the world. And I think psychedelic therapy can help us get there. I don't think it's by itself going to solve everything, but I actually do think it can play a very big role. If these medicines become approved, accepted, and reimbursed, then they can play a really big role in reducing human suffering. Because like from the previous question, people do these things and then start eating better. So now we're helping like nutrition and other wellness things, right? Addiction goes down. And then more future thinking thoughts are so far like parts that excite me. A lot of our psychedelic research has focused on adults. And so I think once things become FDA approved, there should be more research on children, of course, in safe contexts and like very controlled doses, and probably have to do lighter doses. But we give Tylenol to kids and we give many drugs to kids that we know will help them. And we have to be mindful about what we're giving kids. But I would love to see research around exploring maybe lower doses of these medicines in children. I'm not saying for sure it'll work. I would just love to see data because, I mean, that's the source, right? Parenting is one, but childhood trauma is the source of all things,
huge,
right?
Yeah. Huge.
There is a lot of research happening right now and companies looking into if you take the hallucinogenic component out of a psychedelic, can this still be useful? And so that excites me too. And that's kind of controversial because a lot of people think the trip and that altered state is like what gets you there. And I mean, in many ways, I agree for sure that altered state and that trip has incredibly healing neuroplastic effects. But we know that personally, I know just people I know, even if there's FDA approval, even if these medicines are covered by insurance, people will be scared of an altered state. And so there's a barrier to access, right? Like, even if the whole world says it's acceptable, some people don't really want to be in an altered state at all. I mean, alcohol is accessible for almost everyone. And I'm an example. I've never drank. It's just something I don't want to do, right? And so I'm excited about this thing of psychedelic compounds without the hallucinogenic effect and where that leads.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
I should probably say not that I've never drank, but that I don't drink.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is true because I mean, there is a lot of fear. There's a lot of misunderstanding. And I'm curious, maybe even just speaking to that, maybe as a last point, is just talking about the safety, because when it's done properly, it's very safe. And so I wish you would speak to that if you don't mind.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So there are lots of misconceptions and stigmas and taboos around psychedelics. And that stems from, we could have a whole other episode on the war on drugs and propaganda and political objectives around this, but we won't. The short of it is traditional psychedelics, when compared to other substances like caffeine and sugar, or, well, I won't get into the whole list, many other substances, are essentially non-toxic. So you can't overdose. Like, you will never hear of someone overdosing from mushrooms, and non-habit forming, so you don't get addicted. Nevertheless, that's not to say, okay, just take them and you'll be fine. You can't overdose and there's not really many side effects and you can't get addicted. Just take them, eat them like chocolate. No, this is not the case, because you can have a bad trip and that can have consequences. Yes, for sure. And not everyone is a good candidate for psychedelic therapy. And so that's why, going back to where I started, I'm not talking about doing psychedelics recreationally. I'm talking about psychedelic assisted therapy. And there are a lot of considerations to be made for people's safety when doing psychedelic assisted therapy. And that's why in clinical settings, in supervised settings, the chance of adverse effects is so low. It's like 0.01%. Like, we don't see these bad trips or an episode that leads to X, Y, or Z. This really doesn't happen in clinical settings. And that's because with the right protocols, there isn't really room for it. So it's very important when seeking these medicines that you are with someone who's trained and licensed, that you, like we already talked about ketamine infusions versus ketamine assisted therapy, that you are spending time in preparation. So you don't just Google something and be like, okay, I'm going to do some psychedelic therapy. Like today's Wednesday, I'm going to do some psychedelic therapy this Friday. No, you need to spend time mentally preparing both with the therapist and with yourself of what your intentions are for an experience like this. Small side note to a really good book, if people are interested, Immortality Key by Brian Murarescu, talks about like the history of psychedelics and civilizations. And been a while since I read it and I have bad memory, but I believe he says in ancient Greek cultures, this was something that you would prepare your whole life for decades. You would really be thinking about for decades what that psychedelic experience is going to be like. We don't need to wait that long, but definitely be intentional. I mean, some people might wait decades. That's okay. And then doing it in the right setting where there's like someone licensed around, and then also making sure that integration is incorporated. What integration is: post medication session, having therapy sessions with your psychedelic assisted therapist to really cement and set in stone a lot of those things that you were learning when you were in this more neuroplastic state. You can set those in stone by doing integration, and without doing integration, you had a really good experience, but you're probably not going to have as much lasting change. But yeah, all of these things are important for harm reduction. And also, I should have mentioned that the first step when you go to a provider is a psychiatric and a medical assessment. So if someone's not doing that, don't go there. But because you do need to make sure you're a good fit. So, and you're not in a position to determine that. There's a trained professional that'll do a psychiatric and medical assessment and make sure you are a good fit. And it's very rare that someone would not be, but there are some reasons why someone would not be. For example, maybe if you're breastfeeding or have extremely high blood pressure. So yeah.
I just want to thank you so much again for sharing all of this wisdom. I'm curious too, maybe if there's any last words or maybe a question that you wish that I asked that I didn't, or any last things you'd like to share.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't actually go into couples therapy. So I'll say a couple things maybe about that. But initially, one of the major things psychedelics were used to study, especially MDMA in the 60s, was for couples therapy. And goes back to, it cultivates this feeling of connectedness and increases oxytocin. And so if you're doing it alone, you will feel connected to yourself or to nature or maybe to God. But if you're doing it with a person that you love, it's this very unique experience and you'll feel more connected with them. And I think specific for your audience, women are actually the ones that often initiate couples therapy, because whether we like it or not, often like the burden of fixing a relationship falls on us, not always, but often. And so now, coming back to where we are with the research now, there's been incredible results of using psychedelics as part of couples therapy. And then another thing, sorry, I'm giving you a few things that maybe I didn't talk about that would be good, is just like a quick kind of review of when I say psychedelics, what am I talking about in terms of compounds? So traditional psychedelics are things like psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, and MDMA, which is commonly known as on the street. MDMA is a purer form of what's commonly known as Molly or ecstasy. And then there's ketamine, which is not a traditional psychedelic. It works on a different receptor, which I did already explain in detail a little bit. And then there's LSD, commonly known as acid. And then there's a whole slew of others that have been used, some for millennia, ayahuasca and mescaline, and some of these are used in ancestrally and sacred ceremonies. But what I will say is that where we stand, ketamine is legal and available. The FDA has granted breakthrough status to MDMA, psilocybin, and LSD, which means they're fast tracking its approval because they see how significant it is. And MDMA, it's been slated for approval The application's been made to the FDA and the approval is slated for August 2024, which is great. Psilocybin will likely be approved the year after, so in 2025. And then LSD was just given breakthrough status for anxiety, so less clear about the timeline there.
Very exciting. Yes. So I'm wondering too, if anyone wants to learn more about Enthea or any way they want to connect with you, if you could just share where everyone can find you and learn more.
Yeah, you can find more about Enthea on our website at Enthea, which is enthea.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Sherry Rais, Sagrery and Rais. You can also email me directly at sherry@enthea.com. And yeah, I'm happy to connect with people and answer questions offline.
Beautiful. Thank you so much again for being here. It's such a joy to connect and to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And thank you all too for listening. Again, if you have questions, just to let us know. And thank you for being a part of the community. See you next week. Thank you for listening to the Find Your Feminine Fire podcast. If you loved this episode, please go ahead and forward it right now to someone you know would love it. And if you've not had a chance yet to leave us a rave review on Apple Podcasts, please make sure to rate and review if you enjoyed it, as well as make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you want to stay connected, make sure to go to amandatesta.com/thegoods to download your free sensuality activation and stay connected. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.